Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the University of the Underground, where we are exploring the topic of religion, belief systems, and their intersection with politics, nation state, society, and more. I am Naum, the head of program, and I would like to welcome our researchers, and to anyone else that is watching this video, I kindly ask you to support our program. Oh my God. This talk is going to be 40 minutes, followed by 15-minute Q&A with our special guest, Stuart Nolan. I'm very excited to have Stuart, who I've known for already a few years, because Stuart is a professional performer and artist. For the past 40 years, he's been working his artistic and research career. He's a researcher at Lancaster Institute for Contemporary Arts, and he's investigating the cultural history of mind reading from the 19th century theatrical mentalism to present day. His art practice combines traditional disciplines of deception with innovative and questionable technologies that have included a mind-reading robot bird, which was very famous, and AI that believes in magic. We've been asking this question this week. Fortune-telling blockchains, and a device that makes a person's arm invisible. Stuart has co-founded the Magic Research Group, and he's the co-editor of the Journal of Performance Magic. So I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting conversation. So Stuart, welcome to the stage.
Hello. Could I start by asking whether it's possible that you can switch your videos on just for the first bit? If you really can't, if there's a genuine reason you really don't want to be seen right now, then that's obviously fine. But if at all possible, I'd like to see all of your beautiful, wonderful faces. And because I'm going to ask you to, I'm going to start by doing something physical, and it'd be fun to be able to watch you do this. So, okay, we've got most people. I think that's good. Oh, yes, cool. Hello. So I'm aware that this is Friday afternoon, and am I the last speaker? Yeah. Okay. So I expect that you are all absolutely shattered, and your brains are completely full, and you're thinking it's Friday, and yeah. So we'll take this easy, and we'll start by playing a little bit and start by kind of stretching. So I'm going to have you do something. I'm not going to talk about why I get you to do this until the middle of the talk. So you'll have to remember it for a little bit. But it's a good physical thing to get you into some of the things I'll talk about later. So could you all stand up? If this is something that you would have difficulty doing, please don't worry, just watch other people do it. But if you can, stand up, find somewhere to stand up so that you're not propping yourself up. You're not holding yourself up on anything at all. You're standing freely, and close your eyes. And just take a moment to check in with your body. Listen to your body, listen to your feet, and think about what your feet and your legs are doing when you're standing up. You'll notice that when you're standing up, especially with your eyes closed, that you'll tilt in one direction, and then you'll catch yourself. You'll tilt in another direction and then catch yourself. It's a process of continually tilting and catching yourself. Standing up isn't something that you just do and then you're stood up. Standing up is a process of continually not falling over. So continually doing that, continually monitoring your body. So now I'm going to ask you to do something, and this works best if you do this with your best imagination. So when I ask you to imagine something, really do imagine this. Imagine this as best as you can. I want you to imagine something that's going to happen in your life in the future. choose something good, something that you think will be nice, and imagine yourself physically in that moment. Physically imagine yourself being there in that moment as well as you can. Imagine as many things as you can about it. And now notice that when you do that, your body tilts forwards. I can see in particular, Chloe is doing a really good tilt forward there. Some of you will tilt more. Some of you will have naturally stronger physical imaginations. But with practice, with imagining things, everybody will do this. And I can see several of you tilting. Sometimes people tilt so much they have to catch themselves from falling over. Okay, now imagine yourself in the past. Imagine yourself in a good moment in the past, and imagine yourself physically being there. And notice how your body will now tilt backwards. The effect is probably a bit less because now you know what's supposed to happen, and your brain is busy thinking about why it happens, and that's distracting you from actually just letting your body do it. But it's still working for you. Brilliant. Okay, you can open your eyes and take a seat. Thank you very much. So this is a physical effect that works, at least in the way that I did it, will work with most languages. There are a few languages, mixed tech, a couple of Amazonian languages, that conceptualize the past in front of us rather than behind us, and conceptualize the future behind us, which I think is quite a nice way of thinking of the future. The future is something that we can't see because we haven't been there, and so it's behind us because it's invisible to us, and we're backing into the future blindly. I think that's quite a humble way of thinking about the future. But the reason I show you this is because of it's a principle that a lot of my work has been based on, and it's a principle that some of my historical research is based on. A research group in Aberdeen University did exactly this experiment. They had people think of something in the future and something in the past, and they put sensors on them, and they noticed that even people who think they aren't tilting, even people who don't feel themselves tilting, will be tilting a little bit. They just put accelerometers on them. So not only can you do this to people by watching them as a kind of mind reading, but if you put sensors on them and ask people to imagine things, you can work out what they're imagining. And given that VR glasses all pretty much have accelerometers in them now, we have an interesting way of interacting with people's subconscious minds. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a bunch of things. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see that? Excellent. Right. So I was asked if I'd talk about magic and deception in the institution. That's a huge and interesting topic. I decided to focus on a small part of that. I wanted to focus on the notion of telepathy. And really, I want to talk about a particular strand of telepathy, a particular idea of telepathy that's very much a Western idea of telepathy. And there are many other ways of conceptualizing telepathy. There are many other notions of telepathy that come from other cultures. I want to be clear that I'm focusing on a very specific strand of the idea of telepathy, partly because it's been a very influential one. It's very much framed the way the United States thinks about the mind. It's framed the dominant neoliberal capitalist culture. You'll find throughout my talk a not very well hidden critique of capitalist culture and its view of how the brain works and how the mind works. And so this this idea of telepathy starts really with ideas of angels. This image here is the archangel Uriel informing Gabriel that Satan is in the Garden of Eden. Now, Uriel is the angel of the arts, of writing, and the angel of presence, which means Uriel, as a prince of presence, is allowed to enter into the presence of God and so experience pure meaning. So Uriel has been called an angel of the metaphysics of presence, so representing this tradition in Western philosophy that emphasizes immediate access to meaning, so privileging presence over absence, which a lot of continental philosophers has argued leads to an othering of other cultures and an ignoring of things that aren't immediately in front of you. So this kind of ontotheology has shaped our dreams of immediate access to thought, because angels have a kind of innate telepathy. Yeah. So this view of mind-to-mind communication is strong in Christian culture because of this idea of angelic community. Angels have no bodies. So angels have nowhere to hide their thoughts. Angels are transparent to each other. But it's, by the way, it's quite difficult to find an image of an angel without a body, because how do you have an image without a body? But I found this, which is an illustration of a scene from Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials, which seems a bit like an angel without a body. So the angelologies of people like Augustine and Aquinas and others give us this idea of a shared interior of communication, an interior that's perceived nonetheless by others. So angels understand each other in a kind of instantaneous unfurling of interiorities. We still have this dream of communicating like angels, which I would say persists in the dreams of people like Elon Musk, wanting a kind of technological telepathy. So nowadays we might see this turning up in the idea of mind reading technologies, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So telepathy might seem like a really simple idea, but it leads us to some really complicated ideas about what thoughts are. So once we have the idea that thoughts can travel out of our minds and into the minds of others, that leads us to the idea that thoughts themselves are forces or they're objects, that they're things that can be captured and controlled by technology, that they can be photographed, that they can have a kind of life of their own. So this particularly strong tradition in the US really began with the history of the New Thought movement. The New Thought movement, I think, is under-researched in terms of the influence it's had on modern US. It was very influential on positive thinking movements, very influential on the prosperity gospel, and it was part of a particular kind of mentalism. So a view that the human mind can be developed to be capable of extraordinary abilities. This is sometimes referred to as mental magic, and other people, the historians of the prosperity gospel, will often call this mind power. This was very much influenced by the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who communicated with angels. So this is how they really got their idea of wanting to be like angels. But it was also strongly influenced by theosophy, and theosophy had an openness to a whole variety of more ancient and Eastern traditions. And it was influenced by spiritualism. So in some ways, it was a very spiritual, progressive, proto-feminist, anti-racist, at quite an early time movement. So it began with these very good, very spiritual intentions about telepathy. And it was really started by Phineas Quimby. Phineas Quimby began as a clockmaker and daguerreotype maker. And you can see here a daguerreotype that he made of him mesmerizing his assistant. He began as clockmaker, then he saw the French mesmerist Poyen performing and decided he wanted to do that. At the time, mesmerists would often mesmerize somebody and then that person would cure people. So this was what was called the mind cure movement. But Quimby realized that he didn't really need to mesmerize somebody. He didn't need an assistant. He ditched him. All he really needed to do was talk to people. So he really invented the idea of a talking cure quite a while before Freud. But his model of what was happening in this talking cure, which comes from the fact that he made daguerreotypes, was his belief that you could daguerreotype one mind onto another. So a mind could be imprinted onto somebody else's mind in the same way that photographs could do a kind of imprinting. So he had a technological frame right from the very start. So I mentioned that it was a proto-feminist movement. We had people like Florence Scovel-Shinn, an illustrator living in New York, who was a very big teacher of New Thought. She really popularized the idea of what we now call the law of attraction. So the idea that if we just wish for things, we can attract them to ourselves. And we see the ideas from the New Thought movement turning up again and again through 20th century culture, and generally being sold as though they're new things. So she was quite remarkable because not only was she a woman writer, but she was writing for a particular female audience at the time. Because the other thing that was happening around New Thought was new technologies that were framing how people talked about the mind. So metaphors of machinery, of power, of electricity, of dynamism, and of invisible forces. So this was a time when we were learning about X-rays, about magnetism, electricity, but also things like psychology, the beginnings of psychology, the idea of things like advertising and propaganda being in themselves invisible forces. So thinking about thoughts as being invisible forces, that in the same way as mechanical forces and scientific forces. So it was a scientific movement, but it quickly became secularized in the early part of the 20th century. What began as a program of individual spiritual development became much more about individual worldly success. So it became from the idea that we could find our own salvation. It developed into the idea that through our own thoughts, we can become wealthy on the earth. And so we had things like Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, which has sold now over 100 million copies, one of the best-selling business self-help books. And he frames telepathy again as a kind of technology. So he writes things like every human brain is both a broadcasting and receiving station for the vibration of thoughts, and that the creative imagination is the receiving set of the brain, which receives thoughts released by the brains of others. So thinking of thoughts as being technical things. And from that New Thought thinking grew the huge industry of self-help books focused on having success on the earth, not waiting until you get to heaven for your reward, but if you just think and you have the correct way of thinking, then you will become rich. It doesn't matter where you were born, it doesn't matter your circumstances, none of that makes a difference. You should just think the correct thoughts and you can become rich. And we see that played out again and again in the culture of the United States. So taking a jump now to quite some time later, Louise Hay, again, a very successful self-help author and publisher. So she set up Hay Publishing that has about 130 self-help type authors, people like Deepak Chopra, Wayne Dyer, Esther Hicks, really big authors. She studied New Thought when she was young. She studied Scovel-Shinn, who believes that positive thinking can change your material circumstances. And Ernest Holmes, who taught that positive thinking could heal the body. So I would recommend, if you're interested in this kind of thing, watching this short film. It's about 18 minutes long, by Matt Wolf called Another Hayride, that's available on Vimeo. It's about the HIV and AIDS support groups that Louise Hay ran, where she taught people in the support groups that they could heal themselves of HIV and AIDS simply by loving themselves. It's a controversy that I'm not going to go into now, but if you're interested in that, I'd highly recommend that film. So perhaps the apogee of this kind of thinking was Norman Vincent Peale's The Power of Positive Thought. Published in 1952, it was on the Times bestseller list for 186 weeks. It's been translated into over 40 languages, and Donald Trump has called Peale his pastor and one of the greatest speakers he'd ever seen. Trump's parents traveled with their children to hear him. They played his sermons to Trump when he was a child, and Peale officiated at Trump's first wedding. So Trump credits his survival in 1990 after bankruptcy to Peale's positive thinking teachings. And his thinking is really behind Trump's belief that we can get rid of COVID by simply wishing hard enough, just using our thoughts, and that we don't really need science or vaccines or anything. The book expresses a belief in both telepathy and clairvoyance. So those beliefs are still strong in these modern New Thought writings. It's also interestingly been criticized for its similarity to hypnosis techniques. So when you read the book, what you're really being taught are methods of self-hypnosis that takes us all the way back to the fact that the founders of New Thought were mesmerists. And then the biggest book of recent times would be Rhonda Byrne's The Secret, a huge bestseller, sold over 30 million copies worldwide, 300 million in sales. And it's really a rewriting of early New Thought books. We can see this kind of thing parodied. If you've seen Wonder Woman 84, you'll see this character, Max Lord, who's really a parody of these kind of positive thinking approaches. There's a line from the film where he's talking to the president of the United States, saying, "You are a man of faith, and I've been very blessed lately. I want to share my blessing with you. The power of positive thinking. Now tell me, Mr. President, what do you need? And you're not speaking to me here, but to the universe." These are very much New Thought ideas from the mid to late 19th century. So enough about New Thought. I'm interested in the link between New Thought and stage performers. And if I define New Thought mentalism as the belief that the mind can have extraordinary abilities, then theatrical mentalism, as it's called, is the performance of the view that the human mind can be developed to be capable of extraordinary abilities. So this is the kind of thing that I've been doing for years, performing as a mind reader, performing acts of telepathy, performing mental feats, by which I mean lightning calculations or demonstrations of an amazing memory. Psychokinesis is something I haven't really performed much myself, but the idea that you can move objects with your mind. More on the fringe of New Thought, but New Thought is very much about the idea that the universe is created by the mind. New Thought doesn't think that the world doesn't exist, the material world doesn't exist, but it believes that it's created by the mind. And so you can affect any object in the mind if you just think hard enough. So telepathy is a fairly modern word. The word telepathy was coined in 1882. It's often mentioned that it was around the same time that the word telegraph was coined, and we don't really know which of those words was coined first. But it's defined as the communication of any kind from one mind to another, independently of recognized channels of sense. So this is important because this idea of communication was debated. Is it really telepathy if people are touching each other? Yeah? Is it really telepathy if you're holding a wire between one person and another? And in fact, it was that debate around telepathy that that really popularized the idea. The reason that mentalism, or one of the reasons mentalism is so fascinating to me, theatrical mentalism, is the fact that it doesn't really often claim the reality or not of its performances. So, and I think that's one of the reasons that mentalism has been largely excluded from academia, partly because it's considered a questionable practice that's unworthy of scholarly attention. It's a bit naughty, but also due to class bias. You know, it for a long time it wasn't something that the rich would be interested in. Freud famously was undecided about whether telepathy existed or not, and Derrida, who's written about Freud and telepathy, does the same thing. He doesn't offer really any judgment on the truth or not of telepathy. And somebody has written that what he's doing there is he's granting the issue free play so that he can stage the paradoxes generated by the idea of telepathy. I would argue that that's what stage mentalists have been doing since the beginning. So just to pick one of the important performers of the time, Claude Alexander Conlin, who performed as Alexander the Man Who Knows, who began his career as a stage magician and very much doing this kind of Orientalism because of this belief at the time that a lot of powerful and exotic ideas came from the East. A lot of performers would dress on stage in these garbs that were supposed to make them look of Hindu origin mostly. He traveled with huge amounts of this stuff on one train, and all of his support crew and other performers on a separate train. He was world famous. He earned more than the Beatles in his time. He performed internationally to huge audiences. And then one day in a snowstorm, his train of props was lost. And he had to just get on stage with no props. So what he did was he got on stage and he just asked people in the audience to ask him questions about their lives, and he would answer those questions. And this proved to be way more popular than his big boxes and the flashy magic tricks. He invented the newspaper agony aunt column. So he used to ring up a newspaper and say, I'm going to be performing in your town in 2 weeks. Give me a page in your newspaper and tell your readers to send in questions, and I'll answer their questions in the newspaper. So he was the forerunner of all of that. A very strange, mysterious guy. He met twins who were on their way to a nunnery, and they became his stage assistants. It's quite useful to have identical twins when you're doing a magic show. But they also became models in his very early pornography business. So he had a lot of other kinds of things going on. He's also known to have killed at least 5 people, possibly 7. We're not entirely sure. So going back briefly to New Thought, William Walker Atkinson, who was a huge New Thought writer, wrote over 100 books. This book, Practical Mind Reading, is really a course in muscle reading. But he also wrote books under a French pseudonym, Theron Q. Dumont, because people understood that mesmerism came from France. So he wrote books under that name. He wrote books under the name of Yogi Ramachakra, books about yoga. Books that were actually quite good about yoga, but again, playing into this Orientalism of the day. So let's go back to why I asked you to stand up at the very beginning of all of this and to experience that movement. What you're experiencing there is something that we call the Edo Motor Response. So Edo just meaning idea, motor meaning movement. When you think of something, your body will respond. And your body will often respond in ways that you're not consciously aware of. A skilled performer can learn how to pick up on these tiny muscle movements and can sense your thoughts and sense your intentions. So this was originally called muscle reading. In a scientific paper, a neurologist studied a performer called J. Randall Brown, who was very good at this and published this in a scientific paper. And it started a craze for muscle reading, both on stage and as a parlor game that people would play at home. They would try to muscle read each other. And this is where this controversy came from, whether muscle reading could really be called a form of mind reading or a form of telepathy or not. Some people argued no, because there's touch involved. Some people said yes, because it's still mysterious and it's still a transmission by something we don't fully understand. And performers played into this. J. Randall Brown would hold a wire between himself and an audience member, have them leave the theatre, and then ask them to go outside and think of a number. Then he would write a number on a piece of slate and come in and see if he'd managed to guess the number. He tried to read somebody's mind down a telegraph wire, leading from Philadelphia to New York. So people would do these big stunts. Axel Hellstrom in Germany was very famous, where it was the only form of mind reading that was allowed, that was legally allowed, because it has a scientific base. That was called Hellstromism in Germany, which is a cool name. Stuart Cumberland was the performer in the UK in the 10s and 20s. It was known as Cumberlandism, which isn't quite as cool a name. It's more like a fetish for sausages, I think. But on this image on the right here is him reading people in the House of Commons in the UK. So it became very famous. J. Randall Brown, a student of his, became even more famous, traveled the world doing this, reading the minds of royalty using muscle reading. He famously read the mind of Oscar Wilde at the offices of the Times newspaper. He said Oscar Wilde was very easy to read. He said Oscar wears his heart on his sleeve. So let me talk briefly about the things I've done with this. Oh good, I can see that. Just for another few minutes, I'll quickly rattle through some of the things I've done with this. So I did a project in 2018 called 1000 Mindreaders, where I traveled to a bunch of different places, teaching people how to do this. And it's called 1000 Mindreaders because my aim was in a year to train 1,000 people. You can see people here finding an object that the other person has hidden in a room. This is something the stage performers used to do. You can see two people there. One of them has done a drawing in secret while the other person was out of the room. And then the other person's come in from outside and is holding a pencil. The person who did the drawing is holding their wrist and just thinking about their drawing, not pushing their hand around, because that's not telepathy, that's drawing with somebody else's hand. And then they would try to duplicate the drawing. And you can see an example here. That's quite a good example. It's not always as good as that, but try this. Try to see if you can sense the muscle movements of people. Ask them to hide something in a room. What you're doing is holding them and asking them to think about which direction you should go in. And you're just trying to sense the easiest way to go. You're trying to sense the path of least resistance. If you just relax and do this, you'll be surprised at how quickly you can pick it up. The real secret to practicing it is not to frame it as a challenge. Don't say, I can read your mind at any costs, but say, if we work together, we can exchange thoughts. And if you do it that way, there's no challenge and there's no failure. Think of it more as a dance than as an act of mind reading. The best people I've ever taught were tango dancers. Tango dancers are brilliant at reading each other's minds through muscles. So I made this little mind reading robot bird called Edo Bird, using an accelerometer to pick up on these tiny muscle movements. Edo Bird would make two noises, would either go bing for yes or ah for no, and is people imagining whether Edo Bird is nodding or shaking her head. This is Edo Bird on BBC Click, freaking somebody out. So I made a whole variety of devices exploring this kind of muscle reading as a form of mind reading. Ouija Bird was more of a game. and where you would play against each other to see who was best at doing it. We made a whole bunch of apps. This app, you're using these tiny muscle movements to control the volume of 3 different pieces of music, just by thinking about which piece of music you want to be louder. We also made that as a form of a way of locking your phone. By thinking about 3 different frequencies, you can lock and unlock the phone, and it's pretty difficult to hack because these muscle movements are really tiny. The problem is 1 pint of beer and you can't open it. These skills are very much dependent on being quite sensitive. And of course, because these muscle movements not only can be sensed by accelerometers and those kind of sensors, but can also be seen, you can train robots to see these muscle movements by using computer vision. So as an experiment, we trained this robot. It's not using the robot's vision. It's got a camera strapped to its shoulder because the vision in those now robots isn't good enough. But this robot could then tell whether you were thinking of an event that happened in your past or in the future. And that really freaks people out when robots appear to know what they're thinking. Of course, you can take technology out in a sense. What's happening here is I've told a whole room full of people that when they tell a lie, objects feel heavier because lies are heavy, they weigh heavy on us. So they're playing with this idea that just holding their phone feels heavier when they're lying, their whole body slumps. And then when they tell the truth, they can feel their phone floating and getting lighter. Yeah? And it's a real effect. It's a psychophysiological effect. Then they pair up and they lie to each other or tell the truth. And their partner tries to work out whether they're lying or telling the truth by feeling whether their hand is getting lighter or heavier. And within 10 minutes or so, they can tell whether they're telling the truth or lying to each other. This has some bigger implications than just the artworks that I make. This is a technology developed by Control Labs, which was bought by Facebook a couple of years ago for somewhere in between $500 million and $1 billion. We don't know exactly because Facebook won't say, but people suspect it's nearer to $1 billion. That was Facebook's biggest acquisition for 5 years. And of course, the press went mental with Facebook buys mind reading technology. What this bracelet is doing is picking up on the electric signals that cause the muscle movements that I've been talking about. So that it's picking the signal up at an earlier stage, and of course it can be that much more accurate. So with this, you can do things like controlled robot hands, for instance. But unlike wearing a glove, you can control the robot hand even if you don't have a hand. You can, so long as you can imagine the muscle movements. You can also control that robot hand without moving your hand. Yeah? So when they talk about this, they'll say you can pick a keyboard up, type on the keyboard, it'll learn your movements, then you take the keyboard away and then just type in midair. Yeah? But you can also just keep your hand still and think about typing. I've seen the CTO of this company playing asteroids on his phone, and his hand is perfectly still on the table. He's just thinking about the movements. And then, of course, we have these kinds of things, which are much more invasive, where Elon Musk is putting computer chips into the brains of monkeys and having them play Pong using a form of technological telepathy. And I said earlier, I think this is a continuation of this dream of wanting to be communicating like angels. So just a few more things, and then we can chat about this. I can answer questions. What I'm looking at the moment are direct to consumer mind reading devices. So the market for this is growing. People are buying these devices for a lot of reasons. They're getting cheaper and they're getting better, although the very cheap ones are very flaky and they don't really do what they claim to be doing. But I'm looking at them really as a continuation of this 19th century mentalism, that we can train our brains to do amazing things. They have great use for people with different disabilities, to use with things like wheelchairs and prosthetics. So we come all the way back to Professor Xavier from the beginning. Some artists have worked with them. This is Anuka Viprecht's Agent Unicorn. That's an artwork that aims to give kids with ADHD an extra pair of eyes. So the brain device tries to work out when the wearer is paying attention to something and then starts filming so that you can learn about what draws your attention. I haven't seen this in operation. It doesn't have very many sensors, so I'm slightly skeptical about how well it works. But the same, she's a fashion designer and artist, and this pangolin dress is using many sensors. So this dress looks at your brain state and tries to measure a whole bunch of metrics to do with focus, attention, stress, and then moves the dress and lights flash depending on your mood and your thoughts. So this is the BrainNet Tetris game. These three people played Tetris against each other with their thoughts alone while in different parts of the world. So that got quite a lot of press. These cheaper home ones that go for $200–300, people will get together and have brain-controlled drone races. So you control drones with your mind. So moving objects, we're all the way back to this psychokinesis performance again, moving objects with your mind. We can do it with the technology now. We're back to the altered states. So people using these devices to practice meditation, to practice mindfulness using neurofeedback. They're beginning to be used in schools to track the mental states of pupils. This is where it starts to get more and more scary. Commercial organizations have started to use them to surveil their workforce. So this is a small 2-sensor one called the MN8. This claims to be able to track the focus and the stress of somebody wearing it. And it's small enough to hide in a telephone headset of the kind that many people wear at work. The question I have about these is it scarier for your boss to have a device that can genuinely measure your focus and stress and really can? Or is it scarier for your boss to have a device that claims to be able to measure your focus and stress, but doesn't actually work very well? Either way, we're going to start seeing these appearing more and more because there really aren't any protections in law for you to be able to refuse to wear these. We don't really have many protections for brain privacy. So neuroethics and neuro rights is a big thing for me. We really don't have this. The country that's doing the most work in this area is Chile. The Chilean parliament has made big moves to enshrine into law a whole bunch of neuro rights around these devices. So my argument is that this brainware represents a new form of mentalism, that it's a new belief that the brain can be capable of extraordinary abilities, but you need technology to make that happen. And so my study involves a year-long, what's called an autobiology. An autobiology is something that was devised by the theatre company Curious, where they would use X-rays, medical scans of different sorts, and use those as ways of creating performance works and written works. Autobiology is a kind of autoethnography where you're trying to make visible things about your own biology that aren't normally visible. So I'm wearing one of those devices every day for a year to explore its potentials and to question critically whether it really does what it claims to. Obviously not wearing it all day, every day for a year, because that would be ridiculous, and I'd be wearing it now. This is my last slide. A lot of these new ideas of mentalism and telepathy are tied up with ideas of how our brains are flexible, of how our brains can be shaped to do whatever we want them to do. So the idea that comes from neuroscience of plasticity, of neuroplasticity. And the person to go to for an interesting reading of that is Catherine Malibu, because she sets plasticity up against flexibility. She argues that flexibility is the bad side, that if we just see this as flexible, that's what employers and capitalism ask us to be. It asks us to be flexible, work anytime, be on call anytime, be sacked at any time. That leads to precarity. Yeah. Her argument is that there's a stronger form of plasticity. And she argues that for the French, more of a triple meaning of the word plasticity. So something taking on a form, but also the plastic arts. So plasticity in the sense of being the shaper yourself in a way that a sculptor would be a shaper, but also in the third meaning of plastic explosives, of plastique. So thinking of our brains as capable not just of taking on form and not just of shaping form, but of being explosively plastic and explosively taking control. Thank you very much. There's a couple of recent publications of mine that might be of interest.
Thank you so much, Stuart. And thanks for sharing your contact with us.
Well, I'm going to stop sharing that slide now, but of course I can share those things.
Super. So I think we have I have some questions, but I will let the researchers ask first. So we can start with, Kayla has a question.
Is that the question of, do these technologies exist in open source format?
Yes.
Yes, they do. There's quite an active hacker community. OpenBCI is probably the first place to start looking at that. So BCI meaning brain-computer interface. Yeah. So that's the aspect of these devices where you use them to interface with a computer to fly drones, to drive wheelchairs and things. So, oh, somebody designed one. Excellent. We have somebody who knows way more about that side of this than me.
Excellent. Yes.
Yeah, I'd ask them later. Yeah, so I know about OpenBCI stuff. In my research, I'm less interested in the hacker community than I am in the people who buy these things off the shelf because they want to use them at home for some reason. You know, so I'm interested in mass market uses. Do people who buy them for meditation really benefit from that kind of meditation? Do they add anything to meditation, or is this part of what's been called a kind of Mac mindfulness? Yeah, but no, there is a really interesting set of tools out there if you want to start making them. I was looking at something a couple of days ago that's for measuring brain blood flow that you can use to do similar ways of looking at the brain. And that was a bit of kit that was going for about $80. Not EEG, I'm looking at EEG because that's the bigger market. Because I mean, like I say, I'm interested in the mass market of these things. People are also buying brain devices for altering their brain using magnets. So partly to try to experience altered states. And some of this goes back to the idea that the religious state itself, the spiritual state, the experience of God, is something that is purely brain-based and can be just triggered by sending magnetism to the brain. I deny all those very reductive readings of what the spiritual experience is about. Spiritual experiences are communal and social. You know, they aren't just things that happen in people's brains.
Thanks. G, would you like to ask the question?
Hello. Yeah. Yeah. My question was mainly after talking to my sister's a midwife, and I had an interesting conversation with her today, and she was saying about how, like, for example, the practice of midwifery has changed, and how in the past we would have relied a lot more on like visual cues and like feeling the room in a way, and like studying the woman without really like thinking about it too much, and like acting more instinctively.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering how like this study of telepathy and mind reading and relying on technology actually divorces us from our like natural ability of reading people instinctively, and the repercussions of that.
So I think that's a really fascinating question. I've been working for the last few years with the NHS, running workshops on, you know, teaching them how to do muscle reading. And after doing them for a while, I was calling them mind reading workshops, but the NHS started saying, can't we just call these empathy workshops? Yeah? And what strikes me are two moments when I do this hour-long teaching people how to do it. The moment where I say, one of you is going to leave the room, the other person's going to do a drawing and hide it, and then the person's going to come back in, you can hold a pencil, and you're going to duplicate each other's drawings, right? Nobody believes that's going to happen. Nobody believes it will work. I have a room full of faces all looking at me like, no way is that going to work, yeah? And then 5 minutes later, they're doing it. They're duplicating these drawings, and they are freaking out and utterly amazed that they can do this. Yeah. And my big question is, why do we not know this? Why do we not know that we can do this? Tango dancers know it. Yeah. And I suspect that midwives and doulas and people I've met who work with people with stroke and hold their hands, trying to help them re-find their abilities, they got it straight away. But in general, we've kind of forgotten that we can do this. We've forgotten that we are that sensitive to each other's movements. And of course, the lack of touch through the pandemic is only going to make this worse. There's an academic in Liverpool University, Francis McGlone, and he's written about that we're living through a crisis of touch. He wrote in The Guardian, before the pandemic, he was saying that people don't touch each other as much as we used to, and that we know that touch is hugely important in development. If kids don't get touched as they're growing up, there's no touch, they don't develop well. Yeah? We saw this very strongly in the Romanian orphan crisis. Yeah? But we also know that adults who don't get regular human touch, it can lead to all manner of mental health issues. Yeah? And it doesn't take long to solve those issues once you get touch back. He points to a number of reasons, but the one that struck me was the fact that if you're sitting with a friend and you do that thing where you say something, you give them a little nudge, you give them a little tap, there's those little almost subconscious touches that we do with each other, right? You kind of need both your hands to be able to be doing that. You know, you might have a cup of tea or a pint of beer in one hand, and then you're nudging each other. Yeah? But so often we have the smartphone in the hand that would do the touch, and this phone is getting all the stroking. The phone is getting all the love. You know, phones get all the love, man. So this is a real problem. And then of course we have very good reasons for being better about how we touch. You know, the Me Too movement and inappropriate touching tells us that we have to relearn how to touch. We have to touch properly and appropriately, but we have to touch often and with care and compassion. So yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a soapbox of mine, the whole thing about touch. Yes, more.
Oh, I love it. Thank you.
Okay, then Francisco, I don't know if it's a question or a challenge. He wrote, I have something on my mind.
Yeah, can you read my mind? No, I was half joking about it, but actually, can you?
Yeah, you're thinking right now, I bet he can't read my mind.
Yeah.
Am I right?
No. Unfortunately, it's a little bit more serious, my question. No, I was wondering if you could elaborate on this connection between telepathy and the modern world or modernity. Also, you mentioned that you pose a criticism of neoliberalism through your research. So yes, these two topics I'm
Yeah, I highlighted at the start that I wanted to be clear that I'm talking about just a particular way of thinking about telepathy and mind reading and inhabiting other people's minds. You know, there are other traditions. I've glanced at them. I am in no way any kind of expert on them. Yeah, but there are some traditions where you think of another person's mind as a place that you can be invited into, yeah, rather than a book that can be read or a text that can be read, yeah. So I highlighted that I was looking at a tradition that very much began in Judeo-Christian tradition, that is very strong in influencing modern United States culture, yeah, and so influencing a broader culture. Because it's the idea not that the mind is a place that you can go to, but the idea that thoughts are things. Yeah? And once you decide that a thought is a thing or a force, it becomes a resource. Yeah? In the way that Wittgenstein talks about, or Heidegger talks about a standing resource. Right? Once you see something as a resource, it becomes no longer a river. It just becomes a tool for power. Yeah, it just becomes something you can use. Yeah, and that's what happened with the New Thought movement. What began as an idea that was an attempt to get out from underneath the Calvinist view of church, where the church is the place of knowledge rather than the individual, and you just have to do what the church says, and your only hope of salvation is to plead with God for salvation. Yeah? New Thought was very much, no, we all have God within us. Yeah, and you are in charge of your own salvation. So it was about liberating from a church. Yeah, and if we all have God within us, and the world is made of thoughts, then of course, because we all have the power of God, we can create what we like. And the vision of New Thought was very much, we can create, because we all have God in us, then we are all equal. Men, women, doesn't matter where you're from, we are all equal. Yeah. So it was quite a socialist and quite a utopian idea. But it very quickly turned to this idea that thoughts are a resource that can be measured, photographed, sold, that thoughts are a power that can be trained and used to have power over other people. Yeah. And this is just over the space of about 20 years, turn of the century. We saw what was a more socialist idea turn very much into a capitalist view. There was, of the time of early 20th century, when ideas of advertising, mass markets, some of the New Thought authors were masters at things like direct marketing. So Victor Stegno, for instance, was selling membership of a club. This was in 1904. You could join his club for $1 a month, which was a lot of money in those days. And he would send his brainwaves to cure you. You wouldn't have to meet him. He could do this at a distance because he could send his brainwaves. Yeah, he earned huge amounts of money doing this. He was investigated by the Postal Service because he was sending and receiving more letters than anyone else in California. So mass market advertising and mass market selling became absolutely part of what New Thought were doing.
Okay. David.
Hi, I was wondering if you were familiar with the work of Dr. Greenberg is a Mexican physioneurologist who was studying, he did a very controversial telepathic experiment in the 80s that in Spanish, el potencial transferido, I don't know if the right translation would be the potential transferred or the transfer potential. But yeah, first I wanted to ask if you knew anything about that and what was your opinion about that experiment, etc.
Well, I have a very quick answer is that I don't know of it, although I think I may have heard the name. I know nothing of the details, so no.
It was published by the CIA 6 years after he disappeared in Mexico. I have the document and I can send it to Naum for you to have it.
Oh, yes,
you can access it online, right. But the idea is, the premise was that neural activity existed outside of the brain. Yeah, basically about thoughts and everything.
And of course, and in one sense, that's absolutely true. Neural activity obviously exists outside of the brain and outside of the skull. Otherwise, an EEG headset wouldn't work, you know, because it doesn't go inside the skull, does it? And it still works. So brain waves, quite clearly, go outside of the skull. There's nothing kind of dramatic or new about that. The big question is, what can we do with that? You know, how can we see things? What kind of thoughts can we see when we do this kind of thing? I could show you. I don't know if you absolutely have to stop at 5, or
we can carry on for a tiny bit,
because I'm happy to keep chatting. Let me share my screen again, and I'll show you some quick, interesting thoughtography images. Yeah, there we go. So so what this is this video made a big hit a few years back, 2011, I think. What's happening is somebody's brain is being looked at in an fMRI machine, and they're watching. You train this system up by showing a person lots of videos, and then you show them a video that they've never seen before, and the system goes to YouTube, grabs different videos and composites them to try to make what it thinks the person is seeing. Yeah, and it's pretty good. Whether this is really mind reading or not, because really what it's doing is looking at the visual cortex. So what you're looking at is a machine kind of copying what's coming into the eye. Whether that's reading thoughts or not, things get fuzzy and debatable. I just have to show you this because I love Santiago Ramon y Cajal, who is really the father of modern neuroscience. Wanted to be an artist. His dad said, no, you can't be an artist. You have to go into science, be a doctor. And he did the most beautiful drawings of the brain because he was experimenting with this new way of staining the brain that came from Golgi. What interests me is that he was also a novelist, and he wrote a novel about a hypnotist who unsuccessfully tries to create a utopia through hypnosis. I don't know if it's been translated into English, and sadly I can't read Spanish. But he also experimented with hypnosis and telepathy with a group of his friends. Anyway, this is what I was going to show you. Early 20th century, there was this idea that you could capture thoughts using photographic plates. So you just hold a photographic plate against your head in a darkened room, and you just think of things, and then you see if they come out on the photographic plate. Of course, because the mixtures they were using in the day were quite poor and badly mixed, just some heat from your fingers would mess with it and cause some images. So how much what's happening here is the reading of images. But they are beautiful images. This is Louis Daguet. Daguet saw this as a bottle. He saw this as planets, and he developed a device for being able to walk around with a photographic plate strapped to your head so you can capture thoughts. Hippolyte Baraduc did the same thing, but he was more interested in capturing the soul, perhaps, than thoughts. So this is an image of the soul. But he also thinks that he can see a jeering face in this. Another image of eruptions happening in the soul. We still see this kind of thing today. This is an MRI scan of somebody experiencing God. So this was published in newspapers and magazines as somebody having the experience of God. But we have to ask questions about this. You know, why are those colors there? Who chose that at a certain threshold on the signal, suddenly there would be a blue color, or suddenly there would be a red or a green or a yellow color? These are all statistical choices that are made by the scientists. And so this has been criticized as being blobology. You know, it's a kind of new phrenology where we're trying to understand. What we tend to find is the scientists who are making these images know absolutely that they're limitations. They're just trying to try some experiments. It's when they get out into the world and newspapers start picking up on them and misunderstanding them that we get these misunderstandings. This is an EEG image of my brain using the software that you can use with these EEG devices, and it is in no way accurate. It looks good, and it's part of a video. The video looks great. When I play it to people, they always go, "What? Ooh, something happened. What were you thinking of then? What were you thinking of?" So people absolutely read it as capturing my thoughts. But what's really happening there is there's a kind of invisible 3D model, and it's just being colored in. There's no way those things that look like neurons and dendrites, they aren't neurons and dendrites. They're not that big. Neurons are tiny things. Yeah? So this can't be an image of anybody's brain. But the company who make it say that it's for educational and exhibition purposes, which is an interesting claim, given that there's a big chance of misreading entirely of what these images are.
Great. And maybe we can have the last question by Ruth.
Hi. Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the Black Mirror episode where there's like people trapped inside this room and it's covered with like LCD screens, and it monitors their eye movement and it flashes ads up so they never have like any escape from the advertising.
Right.
But no, I'm mentioning it because I'm pretty interested in like the ethics of and privacy laws that you know, like we kind of need to develop. And I just wondered if you know anybody like other than what you mentioned in Chile who are working on that.
Yeah, if you do a search for neuro rights, one of the people you'll get is Anna Wexler, who's particularly good, and Marcello Ayanca. They are two really good ways in. And they have quite differing opinions on the way that neuro rights should go. Neuro rights as a kind of subsection of neuroethics is, there aren't that many people involved. Yeah. So those are two, and I'll put my email address in there. If you want me to send you a whole bunch of other resources for that, because what I find is that there's a lot of neuroethics stuff out there, but neuroethics is a much bigger field, but around things like brain privacy, the other issues that Chile, for instance, are interested in are what happens if we have neuro enhancements, but only the rich can afford them. Yeah, we already have the problem of the rich being able to send their kids or bribe their way in with their kids to the best schools. But how do you make a fair examination if one kid has a neuro enhancement that they can't remove? You know? I'm old enough to remember when we weren't allowed to when calculators came out, we weren't allowed to take them into exams. It's like, how do you deal with neuroenhancements? So there should be a fair and level playing field. You should have the right to not have your brain read if you don't want to. You should have the right to own that data. This data is valuable stuff. And that's, you know, that it's the data that's driving a lot of the big technologies in this area.
Thank you so much.
All right, so I think that with this we can wrap up the session, and I would like to thank, I would like to thank you so much, Stuart. I've been waiting a long time to orbit next to you, and I'm glad that you are here today.
Enjoy the rest of this amazing program you're on. It looks fantastic.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.